it doesn't really matter, sort of who is trying to influence the election. What matters is whether or not certain ideas resonate with the public or not. And I think what's very important, and this is something that even most Romanian observers recognize, what's really important here is that Georgescu's ideas resonated with the Romanian public at this particular stage in time. And that's really the reality that they're trying to hide and obscure.
And to dig into that, I mean, I've written a piece which touches on this, and I know you've been thinking about this too. The way in which you mentioned Georgescu's kind of history, but he's been quite identified in the past with kind of rural or agricultural causes. He's been a big champion of preserving Romania's forests and forestry heritage and other kind of rural elements. That suggests that, I mean, something we've talked about a lot at MCC Brussels, the kind of way in which the farmers' movement across Europe has had this kind of potentially populist kind of connotation to it. That a similar thing has happened in Romania, where kind of city elites have become wildly out of touch with the concerns and priorities of ordinary Romanians, and that Georgescu, even if he strikes an odd pose on certain topics, he's actually more in touch with those concerns, especially in those rural communities, than the kind of traditional parties located in the cities.
Well, especially in Romania, because in Romania, there's a long tradition of rural populism, and that goes back for a long, long while. And there's a long tradition of what I suppose you could call right-wing environmentalism, where there's a kind of real respect, almost quasi-religious respect for the earth and for the rural way of life. And that's been a central part of Romanian nationalism all the way going back to the interwar period in the 20s and the 30s. And what Georgescu has done is to kind of mobilize that to some extent and to try to harness that kind of sentiment for his political objectives. So I think in that sense, Romania is in many ways far more committed to this kind of rural political way of life than any other place within Europe.
As you mentioned, Georgescu might have been part of the political scene, but was very much a kind of outsider in the race itself for the presidential election. But one of the really striking things that we mentioned on the podcast before, but bears repeating, is that this was a rejection of the entire political establishment in Romania. And that has really, I think, driven the kind of severity of the response. It's one thing if you have a kind of a hostile or outside actor running up against one of the traditional figures, but the fact that both Georgescu and Elena Lasconi are kind of outside and they're not from the two mainstream parties has really driven the dynamic here. And as well as these traditional or kind of to us now familiar stories about the kind of pro-EU narrative being called into question and that causing a kind of meltdown, there's also the kind of base interests of these two parties that have really driven this decision to annul the election.
Yes, and you have to remember that these two governing parties have been around for a very long time. They were very much seen as being responsible for the dire state of the Romanian economy and the economic difficulties that people are facing in Romania. They're all also linked to a regime of corruption. People don't talk about corruption in Romania, but it's quite endemic. And there's a real dislike and resentment of the political establishment in Romania. So this vote, for the first time, represented an unambiguous crystallization of all that dislike and alienation that the voters had towards the main parties. And that is really why it was so important, because both Georgescu and Lasconi, in their different ways, represented a different alternative to the establishment, and that was the key issue here.
Yeah, and it's to her credit, even those people who might be Georgescu supporters, it's to Lasconi's credit that she also came out and said that the cancelling, the annulling of the election is a real outrage.
It is, yes.